Hi, good morning or good afternoon. My name is Aubrey Ruby, and I am a senior fellow at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this important discussion about the takeaways from COP29 in Baku. As we know, the COP is closing out after 2 weeks of intense intergovernmental negotiations. And we're here today to talk about what will be the impact on Africa. What did African nations gain at this COP? What progress was made? What challenges remain? And I'm joined today with a group of experts to discuss this and to share their opinions on the emerging takeaways. We know that today was the last day. And we know that Africa suffers the greatest from climate change, but has contributed the least. So the question of climate justice is core to this issue, as is future green growth. And we know that Africa is home to so many of the critical minerals that fuel a green transition. And so the African nations have much to give and need much support for ushering in a greener future. So we're really going to zoom in on the kind of climate finance side of things. But it's my pleasure to start our event today by welcoming Jake Levine. He is Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Climate and Energy at the National Security Council at the White House. And Jake is no stranger to this topic. Prior, he was at the US DFC, where he led climate. And we saw each other at the last COP. So Jake, over to you. Give us your thoughts and how the US is thinking about this COP and outcomes for not only the African countries, but US-African cooperation.
Well, thank you so much, Aubrey. It's wonderful to be back with you and with this excellent team, with Ambassador Yad, with the Atlantic Council Africa Center. Your leadership in bringing, excuse me, critical issues for Africa to the fore and into conversation with government, with civil society, with the private sector cannot be overstated. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to join you. In some ways, I feel like I've come full circle in 2021, when, as you noted, I had just been appointed to serve as the first chief climate officer at the DFC. I joined Ambassador Yad for a similar conversation hosted by the Africa Center. It was my first public appearance during my time in the administration, and I felt that it was fitting and appropriate to begin with a focus on Africa, where so many of the opportunities and so many of the challenges, as you alluded to, for climate, for investment, development, infrastructure, and growth are playing out. And now here we are on the eve of this administration's term, and I want to bring a broader perspective from the White House, where one gains an appreciation with a higher altitude of perspective on the breadth and the impact of the work that President Biden has led to catalyze investment and action on climate finance for Africa. So I'll do my best to provide a few insights from the COP, um, as the title of this meeting suggests that I should. But I also might take the liberty with some hindsight to offer a couple of thoughts on where we go from here. Um, the COP is wrapping up as we speak today, and the negotiated agenda is still playing out in some very real ways. I don't want to get ahead of the negotiators, but let me speak to the main item, I think, on everybody's mind at this finance COP, where I'm hopeful that we'll have had success when everything wraps up in the next 12 to 24 hours. Front and center is something called the New Collective Quantified Goal, also known as the NCQG. This, of course, is the successor to our $100 billion finance goal. And I want to put that into context, especially for folks who may not be in the minutia of all of the acronyms and word soup that is standard at a conference of parties. Recall that when President Biden came into office, developed economies were a day late and a dollar short. We had made a commitment in 2009 at the Copenhagen COP that said we would hit $100 billion of financing for developing economies by the year 2020. In his first speech at the UN General Assembly, President Biden committed to meeting that moment, to leading by example, and to showing what could be done in terms of mobilizing public finance for the purpose of catalyzing the private sector in financing for developing countries. He set an ambitious goal to quadruple US financing to $11 billion per year. Last weekend, in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, the president announced that not only had we hit this goal, but we had surpassed it. Now, what does this mean for Africa? Well, it means a lot because part of this goal is the work that our financing agencies, like the Development Finance Corporation, but also the Export-Import Bank, the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the work of USAID, the work of the State Department, is doing with the private sector. And as a result of having set and met this goal, there are now hundreds of transactions that have transpired over the course of this administration that are mobilizing literally billions of dollars of investment activity every day. Let me just take a few examples from the last year. In Mozambique, DFC is providing a loan of $99 million to Central Electrica de Nemacha, along with an $80 million political risk insurance package for Globalec Africa Limited, which is supporting a 120 megawatt wind power project at the western border with Lesotho. This is the first Mozambican wind IPP to operate at utility scale. It will help to spur an industry. It will help to support exports into the Southern Africa power pool, and it will help to provide resilience and mitigation tools for the regional and national grids. Speaking of the SAP, DFC is also providing $40 million to Africa Green Co. for a liquidity facility that will enable it to establish a track record as an energy aggregator and trader. This will make IPPs more bankable in countries like Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, also Mozambique, also South Africa, and others of the SAP markets. It is a truly innovative and catalytic transaction, an alternative to public utilities suffering from financial and operational strain. The electric sector is not the only story. DFC has also poured into the electric mobility sector with $10 million for the Kenyan bus company Basigo, another $10 million for the Kenyan digital lending company Mogo Auto, which leverages non-traditional data to underwrite EV loans for underserved customers. Elsewhere on the continent, this financing includes support for the important work of developing the value chains for the critical minerals and rare earths that we will need to power the clean energy transition and local beneficiation and development of local communities. This ranges from small technical assistance financings in Angola and Zambia to major infrastructure projects like the Balama mine in Mozambique or the Lobito Atlantic Railway in Angola, Zambia, and DRC. And the list goes on. And it's not just with deals, it's also through programmatic work to support government capacity building for adaptation and resilience, to support work in creating resilience in the ag sector, and with respect to withstanding and responding to the impacts of extreme heat. So the US has led the way in meeting this 100 billion. We learned actually that we met the 100 billion in 2022. We surpassed it in 2023. We believe we'll surpass it again this year. And now we are rallying countries in Baku to develop the successor to this goal. In order to do this most effectively, we need to make sure that those who can contribute do contribute. And so we have been working closely with our counterparts around the world to be in a position to count some of the financing that they provide either through the MDBs, through other South-South collaboration for climate mitigation and resilience in Africa, and in developing countries around the world. The number also needs to be both ambitious and realistic. I will leave that to our negotiators, but we believe that the two-tiered structure that is now in discussion, one that talks about a so-called inner layer of public finance that is mobilizing private capital, and a so-called outer layer of all the remaining private capital flows, can help secure hundreds of billions of dollars in public finance that will help us move the markets to a place to reach the trillion-dollar scale that we know the high-level expert group on climate finance has said we need in order to withstand the worst impacts and to meet the moment on keeping 1.5 degrees alive. There will be more to come, presumably very soon, and we'll all eagerly await that news from Baku. Um, I wanted to highlight one other area of work underway at this COP and every COP, and that is the action agenda. This is, of course, the non-negotiated work, and it really means the work of the private sector, of governments, of subnationals, of nonprofits. This has become increasingly the main event at the COP in so many ways. It's become a marketplace of ideas, an exchange for trading deals and best practices. And I was just struck by some of what I learned at this COP. One example that I wanted to note was in the space of nature-based solutions and what that means for our critical defenses against climate change, our critical forests in Africa. USAID, for example, shared its work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to distribute more than 500,000 coffee tree seedlings and to provide regular support for farmers living in areas at risk of deforestation, including around the borders of national parks. With this resource, farmers can grow and harvest coffee under tree cover, meaning that forests stay intact while communities prosper. At the same time as this was working in Baku, the experience of tech, business, and investors was having a similar conversation in another critical rainforest basin, the Amazon. And they were sharing knowledge in standing up major carbon market transactions that are now supporting literally hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to reforest and regenerate degraded lands throughout Brazil, including with the support of $37.5 million from the DFC to a Brazilian company called Momback, which has created a bankable carbon credit offtake for Microsoft, Google, others in the form of these reforestation credits. So lessons are being learned and shared, and that is the importance of the action agenda. I will conclude with just two final observations. The first, which I think is evergreen in this space, but one that still bears repeating, is that with all of this work, we're still not doing enough. On my last official trip at DFC, I had the chance to visit Malawi to help push a major solar and storage deal over the finish line. We were successful in working with Parliament and with the Ministry of Finance to do the project and to put DFC in a position to disperse its loan. But the victory was bittersweet because all around us, the signs of the climate crisis were unavoidable. The lands were dry, the wells had to go deeper to get water, the food was scarce, and we now know that tens of millions of people across southern Africa are hungry and facing one of the worst droughts in a generation or more. And yet, even as we have the technology to do the hydrological testing, the sensing from satellites to detect and predict an oncoming El Nino season, the benefits of that data, the sharing of that data, all too often remain out of reach for millions of people across Africa. To be sure, the administration has done historic work to bridge that gap. And I think about the work of USAID and NASA, who collaborated to work with the main meteorology center in the Sahel, for example, to extend rain forecasts for farmers from just a few days to a month's time. That has been incredibly impactful in helping farmers decide when to switch crops, when to adjust their growing strategy. Or I think about the work we did with philanthropy, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop stress-tolerant crops that could help farmers in 13 sub-Saharan African countries increase their maize yields by 25%. That work is essential, but it remains inadequate. Full stop. The second, and I think more hopeful observation, is that the world has irreversibly changed course towards a more sustainable and more resilient future. And that is because, and this has been the organizing principle of the US's own domestic agenda, that we know that the climate crisis promises undeniable challenges, and it also creates generational opportunities for investment, for innovation, for growth. That is why countries like Kenya, South Africa, Angola, so many others have staked their own domestic economic strategies on the growth opportunity that the clean energy transition represents. It's no longer just about decarbonization. It's about job creation, wealth creation, and growth. I feel inspired by the work that I've gotten to know in Africa, where young people are mobilizing resources in tech, in clean energy to develop solutions ranging from battery storage to hydrogen to cold chain to sustainable aviation fuels and solar panel manufacturing. These solutions promise economic security as much as they promise climate security. I'm sorry that I won't have the opportunity to stay in the fight with you from here, but I will be watching and supporting from the outside. I'm looking forward to hearing this excellent panel, to learning from all of your work, and to being with you and this community as we take our shared vision forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake, for all your hard work and passion in the area. And I'm confident you will continue to stay as an innovator in climate finance. So thanks again for joining us. We now want to turn to our panel discussion today. I'm joined by a group of experts joining from all different regions of African markets, and really to get your views on the state of climate finance in particular. First, I'd like to turn to Kome Ajibu from the Africa Finance Corporation. Kome, Jake mentioned in his discussions the work that AFC has done in project development, particularly around libido and some of the critical minerals projects, but you also have done renewable energy projects. How do you see AFC playing a role in the climate finance discussions and innovations? And how do you see Baku overall?
Thanks, Aubrey. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think the work highlighted in terms of what AFC has done is really important. Our role in climate finance, I think we see twofold. If you look at it in terms of who one makes the intervention with, on the private side and on the public side, I think we are still gearing up on the public side, and there's so much more that we can do, but I'll start on the private side. We are one of the institutions that have historically focused on project development, which we think is absolutely critical in terms of structuring bankable projects on the continent, especially around climate finance. And I think the work we're doing on the Lobito Corridor is testament to the historic work that we've done specifically in this space. On project development and in climate finance, I'll speak a little bit to some of the work that we've done. I think today we are probably one of the largest co-owners of the largest renewable energy vehicle in Africa. We jointly acquired the Infinity assets, or the Lekela assets, with Infinity, our co-partners, and it currently operates circa 1 gigawatt of energy. This includes wind and solar power in Egypt, in South Africa, and in Senegal, and we're quite proud of the work that we've done there. On the development side, we've also done a lot of work in Djibouti and in Côte d'Ivoire. In Djibouti, we recently reached commercial operation stage on the first wind IPP. Well, the first IPP in Djibouti, also the first wind IPP in Djibouti, 60 megawatts, so quite substantial. We believe this work is important because you need multiple institutions such as the AFC able to unlock opportunities like this that can be easily replicated, right? The work that we did in Djibouti is a reflection of a lot of the historic work that we did on the Kebiolika project in Cape Verde, which is the first wind IPP in Africa. And we worked on that project together with some of the other development finance institutions. It's also reflective of the work that we did in Cote d'Ivoire as we developed the Sengrobo project. So I think the work on project development is critical, especially when you think about climate finance. If we move through other types of private sector interventions, you can think about equity and debt finance and classic project finance instruments, which we think are important. And on the public
Without
sector,
the project development, you won't get to that phase, right? And we've all been
absolutely.
Listening for years on the concern that there's not enough bankable projects in Africa. And so you fundamentally have a challenge on that bankability if entities like the DFC, where Jake was before, don't have the manpower capacity or the boots on the ground to actually develop projects. So partnerships with entities like AFC are really critical in that regard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the game changer for us on the private sector side when you think about climate finance. If I focus then on the public sector side, which is another element of intervention for us, it's something that people are not as aware of because it's something we've only sort of recently started doing. But we also offer facilities directly to sovereigns. And we think this is absolutely critical because they are the largest investors in infrastructure on the continent. And a lot of the work that we've been doing has been complemented by our partnership with the Green Climate Fund, for example. So the talk of the commitment of $100 billion on an annual basis, the GCF is one of the entities through which this is being facilitated to ensure that critical climate finance money to support mitigation and adaptation projects is actually coming to the continent. And the GCF is a really important partner of the AFC. Today, we have gotten 2 approvals. The first was on a private sector project. The second was private sector, but equity, with a really innovative instrument through our maiden fund, the Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund, which will be looking at adaptation and resilience specifically for infrastructure projects. Where we hope to also intervene on the public sector side specifically is through blended finance, right? And I think this is the critical element when you talk about the potential impact for climate finance.
Yeah, I'd like to bring Sarah in on this particular topic on the support of the public sector, meaning governments. Sarah, the work you've done at SLK Capital and the effort to get more liquidity for African governments so that they can actually invest in resilient infrastructure. Maybe you want to give us some background there and why it's been an important area to focus on in the last few years.
Thank you, Aubrey, and great to be here with you today. So I'm the CEO of SLK Capital, focusing on climate financing in emerging markets. So we run accelerator programs and we structure sustainable investment vehicles. One of the examples that Aubrey is referring to is the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility. And I sit on the board of the LSF that was launched 3 years ago now. And it has as a main objective to increase the liquidity of sovereign bonds and to incentivize more green bonds. So over the past few months, maybe I can give an update, Aubrey, on what has been achieved. So on the LSF, there are 3 key pillars. One of them is to increase the liquidity to repo market transactions. And that's similar to the transaction that was announced with ADIA and with Citibank. And we added 2 pillars to that. One of them is to create a GC basket to incentivize interbank flows. And that was announced at the LEC in London in partnership with Euroclear. And the third thing that was launched as well is the iBox LSF USD Africa Sovereign Index. And why is it important? It's important because it calculates and assesses the impact of sovereign bonds. And it allows also to create ETFs on the back of it. And at the moment, we are in discussion with institutional investors to get and to scale that part of the business.
So that's very, very important, Sarah, that kind of innovation, because one of the things we've heard again and again over the years is not only the bankable projects piece, but the problem of scale in African markets and the lack of scale or the right products for global institutional investors. And that can also apply to the carbon credit space, where there hasn't necessarily been as much standards upheld and creation of large scale trading when it comes from Africa. So those kind of innovations have been critical. What's your view of innovations coming out of COP? Is it a place for innovation, or has it been just one of kind of the lowest common denominator negotiations?
So I was there for 4 days so I was there on the 14th, which was the finance day. My take is there was less announcements about capital mobilization and more about alignment on taxonomy and transition plans. In terms of, to go back to what you mentioned about the global markets, the global carbon markets, I think one of the key takeaway and how it's relevant to the African countries is the agreement that was reached under Article 6.4. And why is it relevant for African markets? It's because it removes the issue of credibility and trust. So it allows a lot of African countries now they have this regulation, they have the structure so that they can trade carbon credits and they can raise additional financing that they can channel to those low carbon technologies.
And Sarah, how does that actually work when you said it creates trust? I mean, before there was a very decentralized approach where buyer seller make a deal on carbon credits, but there wasn't necessarily standards. How does this new mechanism create trust?
So basically it creates more structure and regulation and clarity, and it's under the supervision of the supervisory board. So with that, and that's where I'm talking about the compliant market versus the voluntary carbon markets. And that attracts a much higher price. And because of a higher market price, it will attract, the hope is it will attract more investors, more project developers, and more players to the market. And we see a lot of countries across Africa that are announcing progressing the regulatory market, including Nigeria, Ghana, and Morocco.
Wonderful. I would like to bring Deo into this conversation from the view of the IFC. Obviously, IFC is a major player when it comes to climate finance globally. And as you look at this COP from an African perspective, how do you see the major outcomes helping to move the continent forward?
Thank you very much, Aubrey, and thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for this invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I have to caveat and say I did not attend COP. I had my colleagues as a team attending there, and they've been really sharing roundups of the ongoings and the negotiations that are happening at COP. And I do think that it has been generally quite positive for the continent with various opportunities. I'll start off by just outlining a little bit of IFC's work on the continent in four main areas. One is strategic investment and policy alignment. IFC has been aligning its investment strategies by directly investing in projects or indirectly through financial institutions, investing in projects that are really focused on climate. And this is really helping to mobilize capital that would bridge the gap that most African countries need to implement their national determined contribution. So this is very directly focused on helping Africa opportunities in the market. More so, in this alignment is also looking at how directly through financial institutions we can actually mobilize more capital and with a focus on climate. The second is innovative financial instruments across all of these projects, whether it is issuance of bonds or directly investing with climate targets and ensuring alignment to the global principles and guidelines. Those financial instruments have really helped to mobilize capital, bridging the gap, It has helped a lot of financial institutions to start transitioning their portfolio exposures. And by leveraging a lot of the tools and instruments that IFC has put together with this instrument, including concessional financing, we've seen the financial sector really starting to mobilize private investment towards more climate initiatives and with targeted use of proceeds, really supporting to bridge that gap, which was a key topic of discussion at COP, and I'll get to it.
Are we seeing a big uptick in green bond issuance? When we looked globally last as part of our work in climate finance, African green bond issuance was as a percentage of bonds and as a total amount was quite small relative to other regions. So do you think we're turning a corner there?
Yes, we are turning a corner, and we've seen a huge, a deliberate uptick and growth, especially in the last 2 years. I would say a good example is Tanzania, and it really, the pressure is coming on two sides. So the part of the work that IFC is doing on policy alignment with governments has actually seen the central banks issue guidelines on climate risk disclosures for the financial institutions. What that has done is then put some element of pressure to the financial institutions to really look at how do they start transitioning their portfolios, and that has created a sort of an impetus towards issuing of more green bonds. So good example, great success was in Tanzania last year, where we had two financial institutions, one issuing a green bond, one issuing a sustainable bond. This was CRDB and NMB, respectively. And both of those have now really focused on one side, meeting the regulatory requirement, but at the same time starting to have targeted use of proceeds out of the issuances that is supported this. And IFC came in with blended finance to actually support certain targeted areas, such as one that we launched at COP, which is around building resilience in the construction industry. This we did in Tanzania, as well as being an anchor to these investments to really kind of supporting and mobilizing, creating confidence in this issuance for other investors to support. And I would say if we go through what has happened in the last 2 weeks of COP, I think three main areas where Africa is really going to benefit is the agreement around Article 6.4, which is really going to help to bridge some of the financing gap that Africa has today through putting together a framework for carbon credits, and that could really help to provide capital for small, medium scale or micro SMEs on the continent that provide the largest amount of employment. So this will help them to be able to mobilize capital without necessarily needing collateral. So that's a critical step for Africa. I think as David Levin spoke about two more areas, the focus on finance for adaptation and resilience, that's really the critical need for Africa more than just pure mitigation. And secondly, also the nature-based solutions. And the nature-based solutions, as we know, really bring in the critical element of looking at the interdependencies between different ecosystems. So that those three elements, I think, are top of mind as key contributors that will really support the continent's work around developing resilience around the climate change impacts.
Yeah, and that nature-based solution and natural capital, I think, is where we're starting to see an overlap and convergence on topics such as critical minerals and climate finance, right? These are all natural capital that African countries are well endowed with. And now it's a question of how to take that natural capital and leverage it so that you can create infrastructure and growth for the future. Jean-Paul, I'd like you to bring you into the conversation just to see your views on COP and anything you'd like to add to the areas of growth that we're seeing that Deo just outlined.
So, thank you very much, Aubrey. It's very difficult actually to provide a conclusion to the COP, as actually events are unfolding in Baku. There's been a tentative agreement, a tentative draft text that has been actually released. And so far, the first reactions are pretty mixed. So we'll see what's going to happen in the days, in the hours to come. So definitely, I agree with my colleagues here on the panel that actually there have been some advance, some progress, especially in terms of carbon finance. The agreement that was made, that was done on the first day, was actually a major achievement. But if you consider, for example, the position of the African group of negotiators, but also the African Ministry of Environment, they've been complaining, for example, for the lack of result on loss and damages. That COP was normally the place where beyond the 700 millions that have been pledged, the fund, the loss and damage fund should have been actually provided with more substantial sources. As you know, actually, in terms of loss and it is estimated that the needs, the requirements are approximately around 100 to, let's say, 200 billions USD per year. So we are far from that. So for African negotiators, on that loss and damage issue, actually, there's much actually to be discussed, and especially as it has been postponed to next year, the discussion on loss and damages. So then on the
On
other
that, John
point,
Paul, on that
yeah.
piece, I mean, I think that the question always is from African countries on whether these pledges are real, right? I think it's not just within the climate realm, but just, you know, historical experience with large pledges that they don't necessarily always materialize. And so I hear that frustration regularly. You know, you and I were together last COP in Dubai, where you had launched your green banking report. And I just feel like in some ways, I know that there are the transactions that Jake listed. I know that the UAE has announced Altera as a major financier. But you know, do you think there are meaningful signs that loss and damage funds and or large scale capital is flowing?
Let's say we'll have to see. There will be a meeting in December in Maya of the Loss and Damage Fund. So this is when actually I think things are going to evolve. You know that the chair, the head of the fund actually was appointed this year. So it's starting to be operational. Yeah, we'll see. But in another realm, Jack actually was mentioning NCQG. It's another area actually, the new collective quantified goal actually, meaning actually the climate finance that will be available for, let's say, developing countries for the years to come. And let's say if we consider, let's say, the current text that was proposed, you know that African countries and developing countries were asking for something like 1.3 trillion USD per year, actually, to finance all the mitigation and adaptation costs for the developing countries. And so far, the text that was proposed actually by the presidency of the COP is around, let's say, 250 USD billion per year. So it's quite below actually what was asked. And you know, for African negotiators, it's very important actually to have those fundings coming from public finance because we are speaking about blended and let's say, for example, what can be done with leveraging. But so far, historically, let's say blended finance has yielded something like 17 billion USD on average per year in terms of mobilization. So we are very far from, let's say, the 1.3 trillion which are required. So definitely, I think there's a gap to be filled, and I hope that in the hours to come, actually, the negotiations are going to improve that.
Yeah, and I want to bring Kome back into the conversation because you know, these large numbers, the ability to move the capital, because even with the loss and damage funds, There's going to need to be project identification, ways to spend the funds, et cetera. And AFC is financed by African governments. So how do you see the role of AFC and your sister African DFIs in being the intermediary between entities like Altera and others as we try to unlock these pools of capital?
I think you raised a really important point. And I think we take the role of being an intermediary very seriously. Just to clarify, we are financed by African governments and the private sector. So we're a little bit different to some of the sister DFIs on the continent because we have that sort of hybrid public-private sector shareholding. I think we do this on multiple fronts, and I think one of the biggest ways in which we do this will be on the public sector side, which I sort of referenced earlier. I think one of the biggest ways that we can do this is through blended finance, and sort of being a partner of choice in Africa, given we invest all across the continent. I think we can do this through scaling the ticket sizes that we do, through mobilizing additional capital from institutions that have historically perhaps not had the right type of risk appetite for Africa. And we're starting to see this a lot more with a lot of institutions that are interested in potentially providing concessional financing to sovereigns or for specific climate projects who perhaps just don't understand the market as well, and believe that they can rely on AFC's insight and AFC's experience. So I think that's on the one front where we're mobilizing additional capital from outside the continent, but also working sort of intentionally with the other DFIs on the continent. And I think we've sort of had a pretty good track record with this. We can absolutely do more with the other DFIs, whether it's sort of collectively working with government institutions to improve capacity or technical assistance, or spending time sort of intentionally structuring facilities that we believe could also support local financing capacity, right? I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we find. There's a huge untapped market, particularly on the pension fund side. And I think that's an opportunity we could sort of focus on a little bit more.
And Jean-Paul, when you were doing your report last year, which is available still on the AC website, you were talking about the need for a green bank. Do you feel like we have the right institutions at play? I mean, Kome just mentioned the role that AFC plays, unique nature. Obviously, IFC is a player, the liquidity facility that Sarah mentioned. Do we have the right architecture that we need for moving large amounts of capital into African markets and to do the adaptation work that needs to be done?
Yeah, thank you very much, Brie. That's a really good question. Beyond actually a green bank, you mentioned the term architecture. I believe what we need is really a green financial architecture on the continent. In order actually, let's say, to provide those institutions that will be trust-creating institutions, but also institutions actually that can pool large amount of funds, let's say upstream, and then institutions that can channel, let's say, those resources, let's say, to the farmers, to the households, let's say, downstream. So it's a whole ecosystem that is required in order not, let's say, to have, let's say, single operations, but let's say move to the scale, upscale actually the delivery of green finance. And let's say you've got several programs which are ongoing on the African continent to do that. Let's say led by let's say states, African states by themselves, but also, for example, by the IFDB and other stakeholders. But there's a need actually to accelerate the pace, because actually Mr. Levine was, let's say, highlighting all those crises that he was able to witness. So there's a need actually to go faster, okay, than climate change in creating actually those institutional environment.
Yeah. Sarah, I'd like to bring you in on that same question. A lot of the work that we do at the Atlantic Council is looking at the global architecture, whether it be the Bretton Woods systems, DFIs, but also on climate finance. Do we have the right entities, or can new facilities like you help to create fill the gap, or do we need larger institutions?
So I think sometimes it's staying also with the existing. It's not necessarily just with new innovation and new structure. As Komi said, like it's with the existing, how we scale and gets like larger ticket sizes, attracts a different sets of institutional investors that channel capital through the intermediaries, whether banks or GPs on the private capital side. So for instance, there was that announcement by IMCA for the decarbonization of the supply chain. There has been also new players. There weren't as many finance players at this COP compared to last one. But for instance, it was interesting to see family offices, syndicates interested in Africa, defining an action plan so that they can deploy hundreds of millions of dollars of patient capital over a period of 15, 20 years with different metrics that what we are seeing like at the moment on the ground.
I anticipate a lot of that happening, actually. If the Trump administration comes in and pulls the US out of the Paris Agreement, I do think a lot of private capital, whether that be family offices and foundations, philanthropies, will step up to try to do more investing to kind of fill that gap. I do want to encourage our audience to ask questions of this esteemed panel. You can go to the askac.org and include your questions, and we'll get to them in this conversation. Dio, the IFC has the role or the view that it should be taking some early stage risk, helping to unlock other capital. Do you have some examples of some projects that you've worked on, or you know that the IFC has led, that really shows how these blended capital approaches or blended finance approaches are important in the climate space?
Yes, thank you very much. Again, and yes, IFC does look at taking risk. You know, a lot of mobilizing of private capital is actually really addressing risk mitigation in order to encourage more investors and private capital to participate in meeting this gap. With financial institutions in South Africa, one of the areas that IFC has been working on over the last 3 years, actually close to the last 10 years, but the last 3 years more mobilizing capital, is in the construction sector, where IFC has really looked at how do we help to decarbonize the construction sector and increase the resilience. And through it, a number of sort of initiatives have been put in place. One was putting together a tool for certification of green building. And so IFC took the early risk and looked at all the certification methodologies that looked at building green, and realized that, one, they were very cost effective and also not very iterative, and really did not address the challenges of construction, especially in the developing areas. So IFC developed the Excellence in Design for Greater Efficiencies as a tool for certification that's online based, that is very iterative, and really allows for a developer or someone in the construction sector to really understand the process of building green with very clear metrics around what is the energy reduction based on the locality, what is the water efficiency you're putting in, and the materials you're using. So these kind of all put in. So I think creating
kind of reminds me of what Jake was saying about the importance of data, right?
Yes,
data
and really, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the important thing about there is, even in the process to your initial question, is how do we help as we put this architecture for climate finance on the continent? How do we drive a more data-driven decision-making process? So the first that IFC tackled was taking that early investment in creating a tool for certification. Secondly, was mobilizing blended finance with some of the donors around the world. Key to the partnership was the UK government, which put together the Market Accelerator for Green Construction as a blended finance with the incentive not going to the financial institution, but really a pass-through to the developer. And really what it did was to change the understanding and the behavior of developers to really understand that the additional cost of building green is actually not as much as they think it is. It's actually, for example, in South Africa, it's only 4% of the normal construction cost. And then what that does is once they start building green, they realize that the uptick from the supply side of housing, most people who are looking to buy homes are actually looking for energy security. They actually are interested in having that relationship with nature and with the environment. And so the developers have really taken it up. And so the developers are now changing to really have clear sustainability metrics with them. And then the third part of what IFC did is not only putting together the blended finance, is also anchoring the investment that targeted the sector. And so across Africa today, but most successful in South Africa, is we've mobilized just over $500 million with the financial institutions here, and more to come, where we are seeing now that the developer who's not building green is actually becoming the minority. And that's kind of the catalyst process that we've worked with in putting together the tools, the blended finance, and then the direct mobilization of capital with anchor investment and partnership with these financial institutions, and taking that early risk. Of course, the idea is that you put the incentive over the last 3 years, but then you wind it down when it then becomes part of the normal system, and you build the capacity for auditors and the ecosystem with architects as well. So you really kind of bring the capacity and knowledge to understand what it takes to build green. What we are now looking to do is to take that example of what we've done. A key focus for us going forward is going to be around agriculture, the agriculture sector. It's critical for Africa, the largest employer. And then think about how do we do the same, where we incentivize in some ways with the financial institutions, all the way to small, medium scale, financial, non-banking financial institutions, bringing ag tech so that this is information getting to farmers, adopt sort of methodologies around climate smart agriculture, but more importantly, on adaptation and resilience. How can our farmers actually have tools that support them to really understand how to save on water and how to manage this? And then get the financial institutions also, because the biggest influence in changing behavior, as we've seen, is really around with financial institutions, helping them to really understand how they can make a difference by just putting them. But it also helped them with these metrics and tools. It also helps them have a better appreciation of the credit exposure that they will have with these sectors.
Sure. I know Sarah wanted to comment, but I also want to weave in some questions from the audience. We have a couple about, South-South kind of cooperation in a new era of a Trump administration in the U.S. and uncertainty about U.S. commitment to global climate goals. So Sarah, if anything you wanted to say on Deo's side, and then I want to come around and just get a sense of people's thinking for what does 2025 look like.
So I was just going to build on what Deo has said on the importance of capacity building. And I wanted to draw on one of the initiatives that was launched, GCBC, the Global Capacity Building Coalition, which is a digital platform. It offers free resources and also free capacity building for emerging markets to help them with their net zero transition.
Fantastic. Sarah, I will stay with you. Do you have any thoughts on potential for kind of global South leadership? G20 was just completed in Brazil this week, and Brazil brought attention to the climate issues, really wanted to see an ambitious goal. And we know that South Africa is taking over from Brazil as president of the G20. And they're both members of the BRICS. And so thinking about South-South cooperation and South-South leadership, how do you view that in a new kind of era when it comes to U.S. climate commitments?
I will just put it in the same context as what has been discussed, the NCQG, and for the African leaders to continue that advocacy to increase that goal. I've been part of some consultation during New York Week and how to get that 1.3 billion or trillion that's needed to be channeled to African countries. So it just to continue with that advocacy, not only for the quantum, but also for the quality and the level of concessionality, so that it's mostly grants-based or highly concessional.
Jean-Paul, any thoughts you have on the near future and potential for African leadership and Global South cooperation?
Yeah, I think that what was very interesting for that for the COP was the level of commitment of African head of states, the Minister of Environment, and they came with a very strong position at the COP. And I believe that in the weeks to come, they are going to continue to push. And there's a very huge consensus among the group of the G77, meaning the poorest country and emerging countries, actually, that yes, that commitment towards, let's say, 1.3 trillion USD should be made, because it's just you know it better than me, Aubrey. African countries actually are already financing 2/3 of the efforts on their own budget. Okay, so what is let's say put on the table? It's just, let's say, the reminder. Okay, that should actually be brought actually by the international community. So I believe that in the weeks to come, on the agenda, they are going to continue to push on that. So we've been able to see in Baku, but also elsewhere, is a strong presence and a very strong commitment. So I'm pretty sure they are going to succeed in pushing that agenda.
Yes, and I continually remind people that African governments are the largest financiers of their own infrastructure. People tend to look at the Chinese, but that's just the external financing, but that African governments are the major players, but also our institutions like AFC. Kome, any remaining thoughts as we're closing out this discussion?
Look, just to say that while we have seen incremental progress for each COP, I think the fundamental challenge remains the same for Africa, right? I couldn't have put it better than Sarah. The volume and the quantum and the type of instrument, that's really what matters. I recall ahead of COP26, I believe it was, we had published a white paper giving African leaders some type of steer and guidance as to what they should focus on. And I think nothing has fundamentally changed, right? We still think that localization makes sense. Rebuilding our infrastructure smartly with adaptation and resilience in mind is important. And financial innovation is sort of the way that will get us there. So
thank you.
Much has changed, but much still needs to change.
And Daya, with you, any thoughts as we see this new shaping allegiances, alliances, and changing kind of geopolitical landscape when we go into 2025?
Yeah, thank you very much. And just without necessarily repeating what's been said, I do agree that there's much has been done and we've really seen progress. There's a lot more mobilization happening, but there's still much to do. I think a clear capacity building and a real focus on building on information and knowledge at the policy level and regulatory level is necessary. We've seen it being a real push, especially for financial institutions when there is a regulatory pressure. So much work needs to be done there. The financial institutions have a key role in mobilizing private capital to meet this gap. They obviously do require frameworks such as the carbon credit framework and Article 6 to do this. So there's work to be done with governments providing that framework, but their realization that key to their transitioning of their portfolio is also mobilizing private capital is critical. And then lastly is I've seen a tremendous willingness on the ground by our African population, our brothers and sisters who are really keen where they can to play their part. So, it is also about giving the chance through these projects, through these initiatives, which then provide also employment for our population to really play a participating and not just participating, but a leading role in demanding this change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree
that
more
demand
on.
coming from the ground. We're seeing more of it. We're seeing communities taking the lead. And I really find it to be the most enriching thing when you're able to engage with communities and you see that they're driving the need because they see every day the challenge and the gaps that that they are having to face, and they want to make a change for it. So that's where really that's the power of where the continent will have for the transition.
Yeah, I know, I couldn't agree more. The resilience is stark, and resilience in the face of climate change and economic challenges. I came from Lagos last week. Incredible resilience. And I want to thank my panelists. An hour is never enough for conversations around climate and climate finance, because on one hand, they are emotional, they are about justice, and they are also incredibly technical. And so that double-edged sword is difficult to get into the meat, because it really is important to understand the technical specifics of how money can move. So it's just never enough time. And we're committed to doing more at the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a task force on critical minerals that really does look at the importance of investing in critical minerals for a climate transition, a green transition, and we continue our work in climate finance. So I want to thank all of you for joining me today. Thanks to Jake earlier for making the time, and to our audience for tuning in and participating. You will see more from the Africa Center. And again, thank you.